She had problems of Prince Harry and Meghan.
You actually quote the late Queen, and this is after Megxit, saying about Harry, and now Harry has opted out. And for what?
And that, of course, will never be forgiven. But actually, there was sort of several examples of her being rude to staff. I mean, I heard, that she was rude to the gardener, the under gardener, and the head gardener reported the political or economic circumstances I would have preferred to live.
100%. I mean, for me, I'm very clear on this. I think she's the greatest monarch we've had. I know that there's obviously competition.
There's a version of the Queen Elizabeth story that has been told many times. The official version, the ceremonial version, the version built from public appearances and carefully managed royal communications, and the dignified silence that the palace maintained through every crisis that landed on its doorstep during 7 decades of reign. And then there's the version that Hugo Vickers has spent 60 years
reality
collecting.
TV project.
And take on the most difficult role that anyone in this country has, basically, of being the king, with no training. His brother had been trained for the job, and George VI wasn't, and he did a fantastic job. And of course, I've always thought her philosophy was that she wanted to be a very good daughter to her father and do the best for him, which she certainly did. And so, of course, she wouldn't look very...
40 personal meetings with the Queen, beginning in 1968, when she was still a young mother, and continuing for 55 years until near the end of her life. A relationship built on proximity, discretion, and the kind of trust that is only extended to someone who has demonstrated, repeatedly and over a very long time, that they will handle what they are given with the care it deserves. His book, Queen Elizabeth II, A Personal History, is the product of all of that, and what it reveals about the final years of her reign. Specifically about what Harry and Meghan's departure did to a woman who had navigated abdication crises and world wars, and the death of a beloved husband and the collapse of her children's marriages, is more devastating than anything that has previously appeared in print. The phrase Vickers uses in the book is precise, and it is damning. The distress Harry and Meghan caused the Queen cannot be overstated. Not should not be minimized. Not was significant. Cannot be overstated. That is a historian who spent 6 decades in close observation of his subject,
so was her son, Crown Prince
who sat
Hussein,
with her
and his
40
wife,
times
Princess
across
Rajwa.
55
There may have
years,
been a royal or
choosing
two
the
more there. I
strongest
can't
possible
remember off the
language
top of
to
my
describe
head.
what he
But
witnessed in her
whole
final years.
idea in Meghan's
And
head
when you
that
understand
she
the
is
full
better than
context
other
of what
people
was happening
just
around the Queen
hasn't
during that
worked
period,
out, and she
when
cannot.
you place the Sussex departure alongside everything else she was carrying at the same time, the weight of that phrase becomes almost unbearable. Consider what the Queen's final years actually looked like from the inside. Her husband of 73 years was in declining health, spending his last months at Wood Farm in Sandringham before COVID forced his return to Windsor Castle, where they were largely confined together in a bubble that, while intimate in ways their busy lives had rarely allowed, also meant watching Prince Philip become increasingly frail in close proximity and with limited ability to do anything about it. The medical team nearly lost him twice during his final hospitalization. He died on April 9th, 2021, 9 days before his 100th birthday, and the Queen was alone at his funeral, photographed sitting by herself in St. George's Chapel in a black mask, an image that stopped the world. She was 94 years old, and she had just lost a man who had been by her side, challenging her, arguing with her, forcing her to think harder and go further since she was a teenager. The grief that followed was not the grief of a woman who allowed herself to retreat into mourning. She kept going, because she understood that if she retreated, she might never find her way back. But Vickers believes, based on everything he observed, that the grief caught up with her in Scotland in the summer of 2021. And when she came back down to Windsor that October, he says, she looked terrible. Into that grief, into that fragility, into those final months of a reign that had spanned the entirety of the post-war world, Harry and Meghan detonated the Oprah Winfrey interview. The timing of it is something that Vickers addresses with a directness that is almost startling coming from a historian of his careful temperament. Prince Philip was in the hospital during the period when that interview was conducted. His medical team had nearly lost him twice, and Harry and Meghan, who knew this, who were kept informed of his condition, allowed the interview to proceed regardless. The false accusations of racism, which Vickers describes without qualification as untrue, were broadcast to a global audience of tens of millions, while an elderly man who had served his country for 7 decades was fighting for his life in a London hospital. The Queen's response, famous recollections may vary statement, has passed into legend as a masterpiece of restrained British understatement. What it actually represented, stripped of the understatement, was a head of state publicly contradicting her own grandson and his wife on the international stage, while privately managing a level of personal and institutional crisis that would have broken most people half her age. Piers Morgan lost his job at Good Morning Britain for saying publicly that he did not believe what Meghan said in that interview. He was forced out. The institution of mainstream British broadcasting bent to the pressure of the moment and removed the most prominent voice, saying clearly what the Queen's own restrained statement was implying. It took years for the broader media landscape to catch up to what Vickers, in his careful historian's language, had understood from the beginning, a disgraceful exercise. He calls it, and coming from a man who has spent 60 years choosing his words about the royal family with extraordinary care, that phrase carries the full weight of his considered judgment. The Oprah interview was not, of course, the beginning of the Queen's difficulties with Harry and Meghan. What Vickers reveals about the early period of the relationship is something that rewrites a significant portion of the Sussex narrative that has been accepted as settled history. For years, the story that has circulated is that it was William who counseled caution about Meghan, who asked Harry to slow down, who raised concerns about the pace and seriousness of the relationship before it had properly begun. Harry's own memoir, Spare, put William at the center of that caution, framing his brother's nervousness as a form of snobbery or condescension. The picture Vickers paints is considerably more complicated and considerably more damaging to the Sussex narrative. It was not just William. Charles, then the Prince of Wales, adopted precisely the approach that Lord Mountbatten had taken with him before he began courting Princess Diana. Have fun, the advice went, but do not marry her. And the Queen herself, a woman who had observed human nature at the highest levels of public life for 7 decades, suggested that Harry should wait a year before making any permanent decision. The Queen, not a member of staff,
You tell him.
not a
Francis,
courtier
you
with an agenda.
He told
The
me.
Queen herself
Oh,
looked at
that's
what she
nice.
was seeing and felt that more time was
He
needed.
started to blush.
3 of the most senior members of the royal family, across
Still
3
got it.
generations,
Still got it.
all independently reached the same conclusion. They communicated that conclusion to Harry as directly as the circumstances allowed. And Harry, who had been shaped by his grief, his military service, and his mother's absence into someone who wanted very badly to believe he had found something permanent and safe and real, heard that caution not as wisdom from people who loved him, but as opposition from people who did not understand. He was wrong. The people trying to slow him down understood exactly what they were seeing. The tragedy of the years that followed is that he did not find that out until it was too late for the knowledge to be useful. What this means, when you sit with it, is that every senior member of the royal family who knew Harry and loved him saw something in the situation that concerned them enough to say so. And Harry, who has spent years portraying himself as a man who was isolated and unsupported by his family at every critical moment, was in fact surrounded by people who cared about him deeply enough to try to slow him down. He did not slow down. He interpreted their concern as opposition. He told Meghan, according to Vickers' analysis, what each of those family members had said, and those communications, passed from husband to wife, in what were presumably intimate and vulnerable moments, became the raw material of a grievance that has never been forgiven, and, based on everything we can observe about the current state of the Sussex marriage and the reported existence of voice notes and journals being compiled for a future autobiography, is unlikely ever to be resolved. The Queen's concern about what Harry was telling Meghan extended, according to Vickers, to the couple's visits with the children. This detail is one of the most quietly extraordinary things in the book. The Queen, who was a grandmother and who by instinct would have extended every generosity to her grandchildren and their family, had her lady-in-waiting present when Harry and Meghan brought Archie and Lilibet to visit. The reason for that presence was specific. She was worried that Harry and Meghan would take photographs during those visits, photographs that could subsequently be used for commercial or public relations purposes. Think about what that means. The Queen of England, at the end of a 70-year reign, felt she could not be alone with her own great-grandchildren because she could not trust that the visit would not be monetized. She could not trust that the moments she shared with those children would not end up serving the Sussex brand rather than simply being what a grandmother's visit with her grandchildren is supposed to be. That level of institutional and personal caution, coming from a woman who had made managing complex family dynamics an art form across 7 decades of public life, tells you something that no amount of Sussex communications management can reframe. The stories Vickers tells about Meghan's behavior in the early period of the relationship illuminate a pattern that has since become familiar, but that, at the time, was still in its formative stages. The incident with the Gardners is one that has circulated in various forms over the years, but that carries different weight coming from a biographer with Vickers' access and track record. Meghan was rude to the gardener, not the head gardener. The undergardener, a member of staff at the lowest level of the household hierarchy, someone who would have had no power, no influence, no ability to affect Meghan's life in any meaningful way. The head gardener reported the incident to the Queen, and the Queen, who understood better than almost anyone who has ever lived what it means to treat every person with the dignity their humanity requires regardless of their station, got in her car and drove down personally to address the matter. You are not to be rude to staff. That was the message delivered, in person, by the Queen of England to the woman her grandson had married. It did not produce the change in behavior it was intended to produce. The incidents accumulated. The staff turnover that became one of the defining features of Meghan's time in the royal household began, and the woman who had spent 70 years building an institution on the principle that service is its own reward watched, increasingly helpless, as the values she had embodied were treated by her grandson's wife as obstacles to be managed rather than principles to be honored. The circumstances around Archie's birth remain, years later, one of the more inexplicable episodes in the Sussex story. Vickers addresses this with the kind of weary precision that suggests he has thought about it a great deal. The timeline of the birth was misrepresented. The location was initially obscured. The announcement was delayed and managed in ways that departed from every established royal protocol. The godparents were never named, and Meghan herself appeared to go into labor, give birth, and then somehow go into labor again according to the timeline that was being communicated to the press. Vickers's observation is characteristically understated but pointed. She is, as far as he is aware, the only woman in the historical record who gave birth, and then subsequently went into labor later in the same day. The chaos around Archie's birth was not the result of circumstances beyond the couple's control. It was the first fully visible expression of a communications philosophy that had been developing since Meghan arrived in the royal household. Control the information, manage the perception, decide what the public gets to know, and when and in what form. Refuse the obligations of transparency that come with the position you have chosen to occupy. It should not have surprised anyone that this philosophy, applied consistently and with increasing confidence, eventually produced the Oprah interview and the memoir and the Netflix series and the voice notes being recorded at 1 a.m. for a future autobiography. The Archie birth announcement was just the first draft. There is something in the broader arc of the Queen's reign, as Vickers traces it, that makes the Sussex chapter feel not just sad but genuinely tragic in the classical sense. This was a woman who had inherited a monarchy weakened by her uncle's abdication, who had watched her father take on a role he had not been trained for and carry it with a grace and dedication that moved the nation, who had understood from the earliest age that service was not a choice but a calling, and who had built from that understanding a reign of extraordinary continuity and dignity that lasted longer than any other in British history. The COVID speech, "We will meet again," delivered from Windsor Castle to a nation that was frightened and disoriented and needed to hear something true from someone they trusted completely. She had the words because she had the experience. She had been there before in her own way, as a little girl broadcasting from Windsor Castle during the war alongside her sister Princess Margaret. That continuity, that depth of accumulated experience, was the thing that made her irreplaceable, and it is the thing that Prince Philip, for all his argumentative energy and his insistence on being told why things were being done the way they were being done, was essential to maintaining. He kept her sharp. He forced her to justify her thinking. He was the one person in her world who was entirely immune to the institutional deference that surrounded her on every side. When he died, she lost that, and what she had left, in the final year of her life, was the accumulated weight of everything she had not been able to fix. Andrew, Harry, Meghan, a grandson who had told the world she was running an institution capable of racism, a granddaughter-in-law who had sat in front of Oprah Winfrey and said things the Queen knew were untrue and could not publicly contradict without detonating a constitutional crisis. The Grenfell Tower visits, the COVID speech, the "we will meet again" moment, those were the Queen at her best. The last year was the Queen carrying more than she should have had to carry, at an age when she had earned the right to something quieter, surrounded by people who were, whatever their private intentions, making the ending of a magnificent reign smaller and harder and sadder than it needed to be. That is the indictment that Vickers's book delivers, not in anger, not in tabloid language, not with the kind of partisan heat that characterizes most coverage of the Sussex story, in the measured, evidenced, deeply considered language of a historian who loved his subject and is determined that the full truth of what happened to her in those final years will be part of the record. It is a gift to history, and it is a rebuke, quiet but permanent, to everyone who made those years harder than they needed to be. She was managing the fallout from the Oprah interview. She was managing the institutional damage caused by claims she knew to be untrue, stated publicly by her own grandson, that she was constitutionally unable to address directly without making the situation worse. She was doing all of this while Philip was dying, while her own health was declining, while the government was in crisis, while Brexit was tearing at the fabric of the political culture she had served for 7 decades. The distress Harry and Meghan caused the Queen cannot be overstated. Hugo Vickers wrote that sentence having sat with the Queen 40 times across 55 years. He knew exactly what he was saying when he chose those words. The Andrew dimension of the story, which Vickers also addresses with his characteristic careful fairness, adds another layer to the picture of the Queen's final years that the official narrative has consistently underplayed. She did not believe her son had broken the law. She backed him in the ways she was able to back him, most visibly when she allowed him to escort her into Westminster Abbey for Prince Philip's memorial service at a moment when the public and much of the press were calling for him to be completely removed from royal life. Vickers offers a reading of that moment that is more charitable than most. Prince Charles was occupied with the heads of state, who had traveled to London for the occasion. Andrew and the Queen had traveled together from Windsor. A mother wanting her son beside her in a moment of grief is not, on its own, a political statement. It is a human instinct. The fact that it was read as a defiant endorsement tells you something about how completely Andrew's public reputation had collapsed and how little room that collapse left for the Queen to simply be a mother in public. She was always both. She was the Queen, and she was a mother and a grandmother and a great-grandmother. The institution required the first. What Vickers's book ultimately provides, and what makes it essential reading for anyone who has followed the Sussex story with any seriousness, is a framework for understanding what was lost when the Queen died and what has been exposed in her absence. She was the gravitational center that held everything in orbit: her moral authority, her institutional weight, her 7 decades of accumulated trust, with the forces that kept the contradictions and conflicts and competing ambitions of the royal family from flying apart in ways that could not be repaired. She is gone now, and what has been visible since her passing, the accelerating Sussex commercial operation, the autobiography being assembled from voice notes at 1 a.m, the titles that remain in place while the institution they represent is being commercially exploited, the children who have not seen their grandfather, the brother who will not be at the coronation, is what happens when the gravitational center is removed. Not immediately, not all at once, but steadily, irreversibly, in ways that the woman who spent 70 years holding it together had tried, quietly and persistently, and ultimately unsuccessfully, to prevent. She suggested Harry wait a year. She drove down personally to address the rudeness to the gardener. She had her lady in waiting present to protect the children's visits from being photographed. She managed the Oprah interview fallout with 3 carefully chosen words while Philip was dying in a hospital. She kept going through everything, because stopping was not something she had ever allowed herself to do. And in the end, the weight of all of it, the grief and the institutional pressure and the demands of a grandson who seemed unable to understand what his choices were costing the people around him, was part of what she was carrying in those last months before Scotland, before the terrible look on her face when she returned to Windsor in the autumn of 2021, before the slow and steady decline that ended on September 8, 2022 at Balmoral with her family around her and a reign of 70 years. Behind her, the Archie birth story, which Vickers treats with the kind of patient exasperation of someone who has spent a lifetime studying how public figures relate to public expectations, is worth pausing on because it established something important about the Sussex operation that everything which followed has confirmed. Prince Philip put it simply and wisely, decades before any of this happened, in a reflection on what the hereditary royal family offers the British people. The value, he said, is that the public can follow a family through the whole arc of their lives. They can watch children grow up. They can see marriages. They can witness births and deaths and the passage of generations. They can match themselves against the family in ways that create a genuine bond of shared humanity across the distance that monarchy necessarily creates. What Meghan's handling of the Archie birth announcement did was refuse that bond. It said, "We will give you what we decide you are entitled to, in the form we choose, at the time we determine." It said the normal obligations of transparency that come with holding a public role, funded by public trust, do not apply to us. And in doing so, it created the first fully visible crack in the relationship between the Sussex family and the public goodwill that had greeted their wedding with such genuine warmth. The people who lined the streets of Windsor in 2018 wanted to feel connected to what was happening. They were told, in effect, that connection was not available on those terms. and the instinct that drove that refusal, the need to control the narrative completely, to manage every piece of information as a strategic asset rather than a human moment, is the same instinct that is currently producing voice notes at 1 in the morning for a future autobiography. It was there from the beginning. It just took the world a while to see it clearly. He wrote that sentence having sat with the Queen 40 times across 55 years. He knew exactly what he was saying when he chose those words. And the people who spent years dismissing or minimizing what the Sussex departure did to the woman at the center of that institution, who argued that she was too strong, too experienced, too thoroughly in command of herself to be genuinely affected by it, need to read those words again. Cannot be overstated. Not should not be minimized. Not was difficult. Cannot be overstated. That is the judgment of a man who was there, who saw it, who spent 60 years earning the right to say it, and who has now put it into print in a form that the historical record will carry long after the noise of the present moment has faded into silence.